What does a woman do when the man she loves becomes the king who destroys her? When loyalty becomes her crime and silence her only weapon? Catherine of Aragon was not just a queen, she was a mirror to power itself, showing a kingdom what true strength looks like when stripped of every crown. For years, she knelt before a throne that forgot her, yet history would one day kneel before her name. This isn't the story of a marriage, it's the story of a war between love, faith, and the hunger for legacy. Watch till the end, and ask yourself, who really won? The king who ruled the world, or the queen who conquered time? It was January 1536. England lay under a blanket of frost. In a lonely chamber of Kimbolton Castle, far from the royal court she once ruled, Catherine of Aragon took her final breaths. The fire burned low. Her hands, once kissed by kings and diplomats, now trembled against the rough wool of her blanket. Once she had been a queen, adored, radiant, and unstoppable. But on that bitter morning, she was little more than a prisoner in exile, stripped of her crown, her husband's love, and even her name. They called her Princess Dowager of Wales. She called herself Queen of England. Outside her window, bells tolled for morning prayers. Inside, the air was heavy with quiet dignity. The last stand of a woman who had lost everything, yet refused to surrender her grace. History remembers Henry VIII's wives by their fate: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But Catherine's death was not simply the first in a pattern. It was the ending of a love story that became a war between heart and power, faith and politics, husband and wife. This is the story of the queen who loved too long. Catherine of Aragon was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. To Europe, her parents were not just monarchs, they were symbols of unity and power. They had conquered kingdoms, sponsored voyages across oceans, and forged the idea of a single Spain. For them, their children were not simply heirs, they were living instruments of diplomacy, and Catherine, their last born, was destined to be one of the most valuable of all. From her earliest years, Catherine's education was relentless. Her tutors were among the finest minds of Renaissance Spain, theologians, philosophers, and scholars who drilled her in languages, literature, mathematics, and faith. By the age of 12, she could quote St. Augustine, translate classical Latin texts, and write letters that blended intellect with charm. Every lesson was preparation for her future, not as a scholar, but as a queen. Her mother told her that knowledge was a queen's armor and faith her crown. Catherine carried both deeply. Her parents had larger ambitions for her than comfort or leisure. Her life was a mission, to extend Spain's influence through marriage. Alliances in the 15th century were sealed, not by treaties, but by the exchange of daughters. And Catherine's path was decided long before she could understand it. At the age of 3, she was promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII of England. This union would tie two powerful Catholic nations together against their shared rivals in France. Catherine grew up knowing her destiny. One day she would be Queen of England. The prospect filled her not with fear, but with purpose. She learned to speak English, studied English customs, and practiced the composure expected of a foreign queen. Her letters from those years reveal a young girl already thinking in terms of duty and divine will. "God has chosen my path," she once wrote, "and I will walk it with honor." When she was 15, her journey began. She left Spain not as a child, but as an ambassador of her family's greatness. Every lesson, every sermon, every word of scripture she had learned came with her, for they were all she could depend on in the world she was entering. In England, she was received as the future of two nations. The marriage to Prince Arthur was celebrated as a triumph of peace and unity. Arthur, gentle and scholarly, was a boy of 16, pale, thoughtful, and uncertain beside his confident bride. Their union, though politically grand, was personally brief. Only a few months after their wedding, Arthur fell ill. Catherine nursed him as best she could, but the sickness was merciless. When he died, her destiny shattered overnight. At 16, Catherine was a widow in a foreign court that suddenly had no use for her. Her dowry was disputed, her future undecided, and her presence an uncomfortable reminder of a failed alliance. The English court hesitated to send her back to Spain. Doing so would offend her parents, but they no longer saw her as a queen in waiting. She became a political burden, suspended in limbo between two kingdoms. Despite her loss, Catherine did not yield to despair. Her faith anchored her when politics abandoned her. She refused to return home. "I am the Princess of Wales," she said firmly, "and I belong to England." Her words were not arrogance, they were conviction. She believed her marriage, however short, had made her part of England's destiny. Years followed in quiet uncertainty. Henry VII, cautious and pragmatic, delayed any decision about her. Catherine lived on reduced funds, her servants unpaid, her dignity tested daily. Yet she endured with unshakable poise. Even when her clothes went unpaid for and her letters to Spain were ignored, she carried herself as royalty. She believed that the crown was not given by man, but affirmed by conduct. In those years of waiting, she showed the strength that would later define her as queen. She studied, prayed, and managed her small household with grace and intellect. She wrote letters to her father, not of complaint, but of faith. "Patience," she said, "is the proof of virtue." Her perseverance caught the attention of the new heir, Henry, the younger brother of Arthur. He was energetic, handsome, and impulsive, fascinated by the composed Spanish widow who never bowed to misfortune. Catherine's calm dignity stood in contrast to the restless court around her. She represented everything he admired: learning, piety, and the quiet magnetism of someone who knew who she was. Though still uncertain of her future, Catherine's belief in divine timing never faltered. In her mind, she had fulfilled her duty as Arthur's wife and remained a daughter of Spain and a servant of God. What she could not have known was that her years of waiting were preparing her for something far greater, a love that would crown her and later destroy her. Behind every polite smile, every graceful bow, lay a will of iron. She had learned early that true power was not loud. It did not need to be declared. It was carried in silence, in endurance, and in the ability to remain unbroken when others would have surrendered. In the years to come, England would see her not as a foreign girl, but as a queen of rare devotion, one who loved deeply, ruled wisely, and believed that faith could steady any storm. But that strength, born from loss and loneliness, first took root in these forgotten years, when Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess without a husband, chose not to leave the kingdom that no longer wanted her. She had lost her place in the world, but not her sense of self. And that, more than any crown, was the beginning of her power. For nearly 7 years after Prince Arthur's death, Catherine of Aragon's fate hung in uncertainty. She was too royal to dismiss, too expensive to maintain, and too politically valuable to be forgotten. King Henry VII hesitated to send her home to Spain, fearful of offending her parents and losing her dowry. But he also refused to fulfill his earlier promise to marry her to his younger son, Prince Henry, who was then still a boy. Catherine endured those years with quiet fortitude. Her letters reveal the patience of a woman trained to see waiting as part of destiny. She lived modestly, often struggling to pay her servants, selling her jewels to survive, yet she never allowed humiliation to define her. Her belief in divine justice kept her steady. She was certain that her life's course, however delayed, still had purpose. When Henry VII died in 1509, the political landscape shifted overnight. His son, now Henry VIII, ascended the throne at 18. The new king was everything the old one was not: young, charming, full of life and grand ambitions. He had known Catherine since childhood, but now, seeing her as a grown woman, his admiration rekindled into affection. To many at court, Catherine's marriage to the new king seemed uncertain. She was 6 years older, and rumors whispered that her first marriage had been consummated, a question that would one day haunt them both. But Henry's decision was firm. He admired her education, her beauty, and above all, her virtue. Unlike the flirtatious women of the court, Catherine embodied the ideal queen, intelligent, graceful, and loyal. They married on June 11, 1509. To England, it was more than a royal wedding. It was the rebirth of a dynasty. The people celebrated, convinced that the union of youth and wisdom would bring strength to the crown. Within weeks, Catherine was crowned Queen of England beside her husband at Westminster Abbey. The early years of their marriage were marked by harmony and hope. Henry adored her. He called her the most virtuous woman in all Christendom. Their court became the envy of Europe, filled with music, learning, and youthful grandeur. Catherine was not merely a decorative figure. She was deeply involved in matters of state, advising Henry on diplomacy and acting as his most trusted confidant. Her education and experience as the daughter of Spain's most powerful monarchs gave her insight few in England possessed. She could converse with ambassadors fluently, correspond with the Pope, and understand the delicate politics between nations. Henry, who admired intellect as much as beauty, often deferred to her judgment. In 1513, her wisdom and strength were tested. When Henry left for war in France, he appointed Catherine as regent, ruler of England in his absence. It was an unprecedented honor for a queen consort. She governed decisively, managing the kingdom's finances and defense with precision. When Scottish forces invaded England that same year, Catherine authorized an army to confront them. The result was the Battle of Flodden, a decisive English victory. It was her triumph as much as the generals who fought it. She even sent Henry the bloodied coat of the slain Scottish king James IV as proof of her victory. It was a symbolic gesture, a statement that while the king fought abroad, the queen had defended the homeland. England had never before seen such a combination of femininity and command. For a time, their marriage seemed blessed by heaven. Catherine gave birth to several children, and Henry's love for her was genuine. He called her "my dearest heart" in letters, praising her devotion and purity. Together, they embodied the image of divine monarchy, a partnership of faith and power. But beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. Of the 6 children Catherine bore, only one survived infancy, a daughter, Mary. The rest died either at birth or shortly after. Each loss was a private grief and a public humiliation. Henry's obsession with a male heir grew with every passing year. The Tudor dynasty was new and fragile, and the memory of civil war still haunted England. A son was not just a wish, it was a necessity for the crown's survival. Catherine mourned in silence, finding comfort in prayer and scripture. She believed that her role as queen was not to question God's plan, but to endure it faithfully. Henry's frustration, however, began to turn into restlessness. Though he still respected her, the energy and admiration of their early years faded. He sought distraction in tournaments, music, and the attention of others. Despite his growing distance, Catherine continued to love him with quiet constancy. Her letters from that period speak not of jealousy or anger, but of duty and affection. She reminded him of their shared faith and implored him to trust in God's will. To her, marriage was sacred, an unbreakable covenant. To Henry, increasingly, it became a test of divine favor that he feared he was losing. Still, Catherine's influence at court remained powerful. Ambassadors praised her as wise and merciful. The people adored her for her humility and charity. She gave alms to the poor, supported education, and maintained a dignity that inspired devotion. To many, she was the moral heart of the Tudor court, a queen who ruled with virtue rather than fear. But even Catherine could sense that her place beside Henry was becoming more fragile. The court was filled with younger women, eager to please the king. Whispers of affairs reached her ears, though she never publicly acknowledged them. Her focus remained on her faith and on her daughter Mary, who became the center of her life. Catherine's patience was not weakness. It was principle. She believed that her example of loyalty, discipline, and unwavering belief would sustain her husband and the crown. What she did not yet realize was that her endurance would one day be used against her. The love that had begun as admiration would slowly be tested by politics, ambition, and Henry's growing obsession with legacy. But for now, Catherine believed their marriage was ordained by God, and she clung to that conviction as tightly as she once clung to hope itself. In those years, she was not merely England's queen, she was its conscience. And though history would later remember her for her suffering, it was in these moments of quiet triumph and steadfast love that Catherine of Aragon truly earned her crown. By the middle of the 1520s, the fairy tale that had once defined Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon was beginning to unravel. 2 decades of marriage had produced one surviving child, their daughter Mary, but no son to inherit the throne. To the Tudor king, whose dynasty was still young and vulnerable, this was not merely disappointment, it was a threat to the very survival of his line. Every noble family in England remembered the civil wars that had brought the Tudors to power. Without a legitimate male heir, Henry feared that the crown could again fall into chaos. Catherine, by then in her 40s, was no longer able to bear children, yet her devotion to Henry never wavered. She saw the loss of sons not as punishment but as divine mystery, something to be endured with humility. Henry, however, began to see it as proof that God disapproved of their union. It was easier to blame destiny than to face the reality that he simply had no son. Amid that spiritual unease entered a new figure, Anne Boleyn. She had been raised in the sophisticated courts of the continent, fluent in French, educated in manners and conversation. She was witty, sharp-tongued, and confident in a way few Englishwomen dared to be. Henry first noticed her as a spark of novelty, a contrast to Catherine's calm dignity. But fascination turned quickly to obsession. Anne was unlike the mistresses who had come before. She refused to be a passing pleasure. She wanted recognition, influence, perhaps even the crown, and Henry, whose pride matched his desire, began to imagine a new life, a new queen, a new beginning that might finally grant him the son he longed for. Catherine saw what was happening but faced it with composure. She had been queen for 20 years, bound to Henry by the laws of God and man. She had shared his triumphs, comforted his losses, and ruled England in his absence. The idea that their union could be dissolved for the sake of ambition was unthinkable to her. But Henry's restlessness grew into a dangerous conviction. By 1527, he began seeking a way to annul his marriage. He claimed that his conscience was tormented. Their union, he said, violated God's law because she had once been his brother's wife. He cited passages from Leviticus that forbade such a relationship. Catherine firmly denied that her first marriage to Arthur had ever been consummated. Her word was solemn, and for those who knew her, unshakably credible. Behind the veil of theology, everyone saw the truth. The king's moral argument was a disguise for personal desire. Henry wanted Anne Boleyn, and he wanted freedom. But in a Europe still loyal to the Pope, annulling a royal marriage was no simple matter. Pope Clement VII, trapped between Henry and the powerful Emperor Charles V, Catherine's own nephew, refused to grant the annulment. For years, the question of the king's great matter dominated England's politics and religion. Scholars, bishops, and ambassadors were forced to take sides. Some urged Henry to obey Rome, others, fearing his temper, searched scripture for justification. Catherine stood alone but resolute. Her faith was absolute and her sense of right unbending. In 1529, she was summoned before an ecclesiastical court to defend her marriage. The session became one of the most poignant moments in English history. Before the judges and nobles of the realm, Catherine approached her husband, knelt before him, and spoke with calm clarity. "My lord, I have been your wife for 20 years, and by law and conscience I am still your wife. I was your brother's wife in name only. I came to you a virgin. When you took me, I was your lawful wedded wife. I have ever been to you a true and loyal woman, and by me you have had diverse children." Her words silenced the court. Even those who had conspired against her were moved. There was no anger, only dignity, the voice of a woman defending not her pride but her truth. Henry refused to meet her eyes. When she turned to him and said, "Sir, I appealed to God," it marked not merely a legal act, but a moral challenge that would echo through centuries. The Pope's refusal to annul the marriage enraged Henry. What began as frustration turned into rebellion. He convinced himself that his crown could not depend on foreign approval. Guided by advisors such as Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, he severed ties with Rome and proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England. It was one of the most radical acts in European history, a transformation born from one man's desire to replace his queen. Catherine's world collapsed overnight. In defying Rome, Henry stripped her not only of her crown, but of her identity, yet she did not retaliate. She continued to address herself as Queen of England, refused to accept the title Princess Dowager, and prayed daily for Henry's soul. Her composure became her resistance. She understood that the weapon of conscience was stronger than the sword of power. The years of humiliation that followed revealed her deepest strength. She was separated from her daughter Mary, her friends dismissed, her allies punished, but she held to her truth as if it were oxygen. Even those who served Anne Boleyn admitted admiration for Catherine's unwavering serenity. She was, as one courtier wrote, a woman of such virtue that even malice stands ashamed before her. For Henry, however, Catherine's refusal to bend became intolerable. What had once been love now reminded him of his failure. He could not forgive her integrity because it exposed his own weakness. To the court, she became a symbol of endurance, of righteousness, of a woman who would not let history erase her. Anne Boleyn's rise to power marked Catherine's public fall. Yet in a deeper sense, it was Catherine who triumphed. Henry could take her throne, but not her honor. Her strength forced England to question the limits of authority itself. She stood for the idea that even a queen, stripped of favor, could still command the moral loyalty of a nation. In her defiance, Catherine of Aragon became more than a wronged wife. She became the conscience of England, the living reminder that faith and justice cannot be rewritten to suit desire. Her calm resistance laid bare the tragic truth of the Tudor court, that in the pursuit of power, love had turned into politics, and a king had traded a loyal heart for a restless ambition. By 1531, Catherine of Aragon's long fight had reached its cruel conclusion. The woman who had once ruled beside the most powerful king in Europe was banished from court, separated from her daughter, stripped of her title, and erased from the royal story she had built with her life. Henry had declared himself free, married Anne Boleyn in secret, and forced the Church of England to recognize the new union. What could not be won through faith or argument had been seized through sheer authority. Catherine was ordered to leave the royal court and live in enforced isolation. Her household was dismantled. Loyal servants were dismissed or reassigned. Those who remained were forbidden to speak her title or address her as queen. Letters to and from her were censored or intercepted. Every comfort once afforded to her as monarch, from her wardrobe to her correspondence, was controlled by officials acting in Henry's name. Yet even as her world narrowed, Catherine's dignity expanded. She refused to accept the new title, Princess Dowager of Wales, the name Henry used to deny her queenship. To her, that name belonged to a girl who had married Prince Arthur, not the woman who had shared 2 decades of life, power, and love with a king. "I am the king's lawful wife," she said. "I will live and die his queen." In private, she suffered deeply. She longed for her daughter Mary, the only surviving child of her marriage, whom she had not seen in months. Henry, fearing Catherine's influence, forbade any contact between them. The young princess, barely a teenager, was pressured to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen and to accept her own demotion in rank. When Mary refused, she too was punished, separated from her household and treated as illegitimate. For Catherine, that separation was a wound deeper than exile itself. She could bear the loss of a crown, but not the loss of her child. Her letters to Mary, many of them smuggled through trusted servants, show the gentle wisdom of a mother trying to shield her daughter's faith amid cruelty. "Hold fast to what is right," she wrote. "Endure with patience. Trust that God's justice does not sleep." These words became her legacy, quiet but unbreakable. While Henry ruled through fear and spectacle, Catherine ruled through moral endurance. Even in solitude, she maintained the rituals of queenship. Each morning she dressed formally, recited her prayers, and carried herself as if the court still awaited her presence. To the few attendants who remained, she gave simple orders delivered with grace and gratitude. She refused to speak ill of the king, no matter how severe her treatment became. When one of her maids wept and asked how she could bear such injustice, Catherine answered softly, "I will not hate the man I once loved. That is between him and God." It was not resignation, it was faith in something higher than kings. Her refusal to surrender her title infuriated Henry. He demanded that she acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen and himself as the head of the church. Catherine declined with a calmness that disarmed even her enemies. "I owe my obedience to God first," she said, "and I have sworn my vows to the king before him. I cannot make them twice." The officials sent to reason with her often left ashamed. Some confessed that she carried herself more regally in exile than Henry did on his throne. They described her as patient, kind, and unyielding, a queen without a kingdom who still commanded loyalty through character alone. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's star began to rise at court, but it was haunted by Catherine's shadow. The people of England, long accustomed to the Spanish queen's piety and generosity, whispered that the king's new wife was no true queen. Catherine's exile meant to silence her, instead made her a symbol of conscience. In taverns and marketplaces, her name was spoken with reverence. Years passed, and her health began to decline. Age and confinement took their toll, but her will remained steady. She continued to write. To her nephew, Emperor Charles V, she appealed for justice but asked him to avoid vengeance. "Do not bring war for my sake," she wrote. "Let my suffering end with me." To Henry, she sent only one letter near the end of her life. It was not a protest, but a farewell filled with grace. "Mine eyes desire you above all things," she wrote. "I make this vow. I have loved you and always will." Her words revealed the paradox of her heart, a love that forgave even the man who had broken her. She saw her pain not as defeat, but as a test of faith. Each loss had stripped her of worldly identity until only her spirit remained, uncorrupted and unshakable. By 1535, Catherine's strength was fading. She lived quietly, attended by a handful of loyal women who refused to abandon her despite the risk. Even as she grew weaker, she insisted on maintaining her routines: prayer at dawn, letters by noon, and kindness to everyone around her. Her dignity was her last act of defiance, a reminder that no king could command the soul. When Henry's envoys arrived one final time, urging her once again to accept her diminished status, she met them with gentle finality. "Tell His Majesty," she said, "that my prayers are his, though my obedience belongs to God." It was not rebellion. It was truth, spoken by a woman who had learned that silence and faith can outlast tyranny. Catherine never returned to court, but she did not vanish from history. Even in isolation, she remained a figure of admiration across Europe. Letters from ambassadors described her as a saint in chains. Her name traveled further in exile than it had in power. And through all the pain, she never ceased to sign her letters the same way, in elegant, unwavering script, Catherine the Queen. In those final years, she no longer fought for thrones or crowns. She fought for something far more enduring: the truth of her own name, the integrity of her own heart, and the belief that grace is a greater power than authority. Her exile, meant to diminish her, had instead revealed her greatness. By early 1536, Catherine of Aragon's strength was nearly gone. Years of isolation had worn her body thin, but her mind and faith remained resolute. She had accepted her suffering not as defeat, but as a divine trial, a test meant to purify her spirit. To those around her, she still carried herself with the same poise as when she sat on the English throne. But inside, her body was failing. The physicians could do little for her pain, which they believed came from the heart, though some suspected an internal illness. Whatever the cause, it was clear that her time was drawing near. Despite her frailty, Catherine's thoughts never turned bitter. She spent her final months in quiet reflection, surrounded by a handful of devoted attendants who had remained loyal despite royal disapproval. To them, she was still Her Majesty. She spoke gently, often quoting scripture, reminding them that the value of a life was not measured by its power, but by its faithfulness. In her last letters, Catherine showed no resentment toward Henry. Instead, her words were filled with mercy. She had long accepted that her suffering was the price of loyalty, both to her God and to her vows. "I have done no wrong," she once told her confessor, "but I will forgive as I hope to be forgiven." As her health declined, she made a final request: a small wooden crucifix, a rosary, and ink for one last letter. With trembling hands, she began to write to the man who had once been the center of her life. It was not a political statement, nor an appeal for justice. It was an act of love, pure, unconditional, and entirely her own. She began the letter with grace: "My most dear Lord, King, and husband." Those words alone carried the weight of her entire life. The girl sent from Spain, the queen crowned beside a prince, the wife cast aside for ambition. She forgave him for the pain, for the separation from her daughter, and even for the public humiliation that had shadowed her final years. She blessed him, praying for his health and happiness. She asked God to watch over him, over Anne Boleyn, and over their young daughter, Elizabeth. The most moving lines came near the end: "Mine eyes desire you above all things. May God have you in his keeping. My body is weak, but my heart shall never cease to pray for you." When she finished, she sealed the letter with care and handed it to her servant. "Deliver this to the king," she said quietly, "and tell him I die his true and loving wife." In those last days, Catherine's attendants noted how calm she seemed, as if already at peace with her fate. She continued her prayers each morning, whispered blessings for her daughter, and spoke little of her pain. When one of her women broke down in tears beside her bed, Catherine took her hand and said, "Do not weep, we are all pilgrims, and my journey is almost done." On the morning of January 7th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon passed away. She was 50 years old. Her final words were spoken in Spanish, a prayer for mercy, the same word she had recited as a child at her mother's side. Her confessor recorded that her face grew serene, her lips still moving in silent devotion until the very end. After her death, her attendants claimed that a soft fragrance filled the chamber. Some said it was the scent of roses, others called it the mark of sanctity. Whether legend or truth, it reflected how deeply her memory touched those who had witnessed her final hours. To them, her passing was not a queen's death, it was the quiet triumph of a soul that had never surrendered. News of her death reached Henry within days. His reaction stunned the court. He wore bright yellow clothing, and Anne Boleyn joined him in celebration. Some said it was a gesture of Spanish mourning, others whispered it was joy disguised as custom. Either way, the contrast between his cheer and Catherine's quiet dignity could not have been greater. But while the court followed the king's example, the people of England did not. Across the country, ordinary men and women mourned her as their true queen. They remembered her kindness, her generosity, her fairness in judgment, and her devotion to the poor. They spoke her name in prayers, calling her the good queen, the faithful queen, the queen who suffered but never sinned. Even those who had once served Anne Boleyn admitted that Catherine's death left a silence that could not be filled. Her humility had become her strength, and her endurance had turned into legend. Mary, her daughter, was devastated. She was not allowed to attend her mother's funeral, yet she prayed for her daily. Catherine's parting message to her, delivered through a servant, was simple: "Daughter, serve God faithfully and trust Him through all trials." Those words would shape Mary's future reign, echoing her mother's moral certainty. Catherine was buried at Peterborough Abbey with modest ceremony as Princess Dowager of Wales. But the people refused that title. To them, she would always be Queen Catherine of England. They adorned her grave with candles and flowers, and pilgrims came to pay their respects for generations afterward. Even now, her tomb bears the inscription chosen centuries later by admirers who understood her worth, a queen loved by the English people. Her death marked more than the end of a life, it marked the end of an era. With her passing, the last remnant of the old faith, of steadfast devotion and moral clarity, faded from the Tudor court. Yet her example endured. Catherine's legacy was not power or wealth, but the quiet victory of character over cruelty. She had been denied justice in life, but history would restore it in memory. The king who cast her aside would be remembered for his failures of conscience. The woman he wronged would be remembered for her grace. Her final prayer was answered, not in the life she lost, but in the truth she left behind. Catherine of Aragon's death marked the end of one of England's most turbulent love stories. Though her body lay in Peterborough Cathedral, her spirit continued to haunt the conscience of a nation. Her funeral took place on January 29, 1536, a modest ceremony, stripped of royal grandeur, arranged not for a queen but for a dowager. Yet those who attended knew the truth. They were burying a monarch who had never ceased to be one in heart, faith, and virtue. Her coffin, draped in black velvet, was borne by 6 knights. No banners of state were displayed, no royal decree issued to honor her. Henry did not attend. Anne Boleyn, heavy with child, rejoiced at the news of Catherine's passing, believing it cleared the way for her own son to inherit the throne. But among the people, grief spread quietly and deeply. They mourned her not as a discarded wife, but as the true Queen of England. In churches across the country, priests prayed for her soul, often defying royal orders that forbade it. Some risked imprisonment by mentioning her name during Mass. Her death became an unspoken protest, a silent rebellion of faith against the politics that had torn England apart. Even those who had once remained loyal to Henry could not forget the image of the woman who had suffered with such grace. The bishop who delivered her eulogy said simply, She lived in faith, died in faith, and left an example to all who suffer wrong. Those words captured what no political account could, that Catherine's true power lay not in her title, but in her endurance. Her daughter Mary never forgot her mother's courage. She was forbidden to attend the funeral, but she carried her grief like a vow. When she finally became queen years later, Mary I toward the Catholic faith her mother had cherished. Many of her decisions, her insistence on religious unity, her devotion to ceremony, her sense of moral duty, were drawn directly from Catherine's teachings. For Mary, every act of governance was an act of remembrance. She sought to honor the woman who had taught her that loyalty to conscience must stand above fear of kings. Catherine's moral victory outlasted every crown around her. Henry's reign, once golden, decayed under the weight of broken marriages and fractured faith. Anne Boleyn, who replaced Catherine on the throne, would be executed only months after Catherine's death. The very child she carried while celebrating Catherine's passing was lost, and her dream of producing a male heir died with her. The irony was cruel but unmistakable. The woman Henry had cast aside died revered, the woman for whom he had defied the church died condemned. In time, even Henry seemed haunted by Catherine's memory. Years later, he would speak of her with unexpected tenderness, calling her a woman of great honor. Whether guilt or nostalgia, it revealed that he, too, understood the magnitude of what he had lost. No one else, in his lifetime, would ever match her loyalty, her intellect, or her quiet authority. History, however, took time to give Catherine her due. For centuries, she was remembered primarily as the pious first wife, a saintly figure of patience and sorrow. But, as historians revisited her letters and decisions, another portrait emerged, that of a woman who was not merely obedient but wise, not merely faithful but profoundly intelligent. Catherine of Aragon had been far more than a wronged wife. She had been a strategist, a diplomat, a regent who once governed England in war, and a scholar whose intellect matched any king's. Her quiet defiance, her refusal to sign away her title, to renounce her vows, or to betray her beliefs was not weakness, it was strength disguised as submission. Her silence was not surrender, it was discipline. Through restraint, she preserved her dignity when the world conspired to take it from her. In her endurance, she revealed the intelligence of restraint, a lesson few rulers, then or now, truly grasped. Catherine's story endures because it embodies a paradox that every generation recognizes, that true power often lies not in dominance, but in principle. She never raised her voice against the king, yet her name outlasted his glory. She never fought for vengeance, yet her legacy became the measure of conscience against which the Tudor court would forever be judged. In the centuries that followed, Catherine's memory was quietly reclaimed. Historians, theologians, and writers found in her life the essence of integrity, a woman who balanced emotion with intellect, loyalty with independence, and faith with reason. She became a symbol of feminine strength long before the term existed, a figure who proved that wisdom and virtue can coexist with passion and pride. Today, her grave at Peterborough Cathedral remains a site of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors still leave flowers and handwritten notes bearing a single title, Queen of England. The words that once defined her humiliation have transformed into her victory. Catherine of Aragon's death may have marked the end of her life, but it began her legend. She did not win through force, nor through revenge, but through endurance and grace. Her story reminds the world that history does not always honor the loudest voices. Sometimes it is written by those who endure in silence, who fight without hatred, and who forgive without forgetting. In the end, Catherine's legacy outshone the very dynasty that tried to erase her. She was the queen who loved too long, forgave too deeply, and stood too firmly for a world that did not deserve her. Her final victory was not over a man, but over time itself. Centuries after her death, the world began to see Catherine of Aragon not as a tragic figure, but as one of quiet revolution. For generations, she had been remembered only as the first discarded wife of Henry VIII, the queen replaced, the woman wronged. But history, like time, has a way of revealing what power once tried to hide. Beneath the sorrow, beneath the silence, lay a woman of extraordinary moral courage, a queen who changed England not through rebellion, but through resilience. Catherine's influence did not end with her life. It lived on through her daughter, Queen Mary I, who inherited her mother's fierce faith and unwavering sense of duty. Mary's reign, though short and controversial, was driven by the same conviction that had sustained Catherine, that truth must never yield to convenience, and that loyalty to conscience outweighs all worldly reward. To those who knew Mary, her devotion to the Catholic faith was not mere politics, it was her mother's voice echoing through her. Even Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, carried part of Catherine's legacy. Though they were divided by circumstance and belief, Elizabeth shared Catherine's intellect, discipline, and capacity for endurance. Both women learned to survive in a world ruled by men who underestimated them. In this way, Catherine shaped not only her own era, but the very nature of queenship that followed, calm, commanding, and grounded in principle. Historians later recognized her as a figure ahead of her time. She had been a diplomat fluent in multiple languages, a scholar educated in theology and humanism, and a ruler who once governed England in her husband's absence. She had defended her marriage, not to preserve her pride, but to preserve the sanctity of vows that kings themselves were expected to honor. In an age when obedience was the only virtue expected of women, Catherine dared to think, reason, and stand firm, and she did so with grace, not defiance. Her life became a moral compass for generations of women who came after her. She proved that strength does not always shout, that courage can coexist with gentleness, and that dignity can survive betrayal. Long after her death, writers and theologians cited her as the embodiment of faith tested by power. Her letters, preserved across archives, revealed not anger or bitterness, but wisdom. The reflections of a woman who had seen the heights of glory and the depths of humiliation, and still chosen forgiveness over vengeance. Today, Catherine's legacy stands as one of endurance, intellect, and moral integrity. She outlasted Henry in spirit, her story enduring long after his dynasty fractured under the weight of its own ambition. The empire of marriages he built crumbled, her reputation only grew. She became the measure of what it means to rule, not through authority, but through virtue. Her life reminds us that true greatness is not defined by victory or survival, but by the quiet conviction to do what is right, even when it costs everything. Catherine of Aragon did not win her battles through power, she won them through faith, patience, and the intelligence of the heart. And that is why, centuries later, history no longer calls her the first wife. It calls her what she always was, the queen who loved too long and lost nothing that truly mattered. In the centuries since her death, Catherine of Aragon has been many things: saint, martyr, loyal wife, forgotten queen. But perhaps she was something greater, a woman who understood that love and loss are not opposites, but mirrors. She loved Henry not because he was worthy, but because she was. And when he broke her heart, she rebuilt her strength upon the ashes. She never raised an army, never sought revenge. Her rebellion was her grace, her weapon, her patience, and her legacy, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not won by force, but by the unshakable dignity of a heart that refuses to yield. Catherine of Aragon, the queen who loved too long and taught the world that love, when pure, outlasts even power.